The garden of Valerius Manor is silent in the early morning. The roses have bloomed heavy and pink along the stone walls, the kind of roses that take decades to grow that full, that proud. Duchess Ilara walks the path between them slowly, her dark green robe trailing behind her on the damp grass. She is 38 years old, and she carries every one of those years in the way she holds her shoulders. Not hunched, never hunched, because a woman of her position was trained out of that before she was 12, but weighted, quietly, privately weighted. She stops at the garden fountain. It is the same fountain she has stood at since she was a girl. The stone cherub at its centre has lost one of its wings to a storm years ago, and her father, Duke Aldrich, never replaced it. He said it gave the cherub character. She used to believe him. Ilara looks down at her reflection in the water. The morning light is not kind. It finds the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight deepening at the edges of her mouth. She does not look away. She has never been a woman who looked away from difficult things, not even when difficult things wore her own face. She reaches into the folds of her robe and removes a letter. The parchment is old. The edges have gone soft with age and handling, the kind of soft that happens when something has been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper itself has learned to yield. The wax seal broke 15 years ago. She broke it herself, hands shaking, standing in a torch-lit servants' corridor while the sound of guards echoed down the stone halls above her. She does not need to open it to read it. She has memorized every word. But she opens it anyway, because the ritual matters. Because some mornings the ritual is the only thing that reminds her why she made the choices she made. The handwriting is rough. Caelan was never educated in the formal script they taught at court. His letters lean slightly to the right, urgent even in stillness. Ilara, I am not what they think I am, but I am not nothing. I will build something real, and when I have, I will come back for you. Not as a ghost, not as a lie, as a man who has earned the right to stand in front of you. Wait for me, or do not wait, but know that I will come. She folds the letter. She puts it back against her chest. 15 years. She looks back at the broken cherub in the fountain. She almost smiles. The kingdom of Valerius 20 years ago was a place of deliberate beauty. Duke Aldrich had spent his fortune making it so. The marble corridors, the tapestries commissioned from the finest weavers in the East, the quarterly balls that drew nobility from 3 neighbouring territories. From the outside, the House of Valerius was the picture of a dynasty in full bloom. Inside, Duke Aldrich was rotting with a specific kind of grief that has no clean name. His son, his heir. Caelan Valerius, born with the mark of the sun, a birthmark shaped like a starburst, pressed into the skin just below the left collarbone, the same mark that had appeared on every male heir in the Valerius line for 4 generations. The boy had been taken, not by illness, not by war. Taken. During a night of chaos 15 years before the story begins, when a fire broke out in the eastern wing and in the confusion, the nursery was breached. The child was gone by morning. No body, no ransom note, just absence. Duke Aldrich, for all his composure in public, had never recovered from it. He became obsessed. He hired trackers, investigators, priests who claimed to read fate in water and smoke. He had a portrait painted of what the boy might look like at 10, at 15, at 20. 3 separate artists commissioned 3 separate paintings that now hung in the private study Aldrich kept locked to everyone, including his wife, Duchess Seraphine. And then the impostors began arriving. Word spread, the way word always spreads when a powerful man's desperation becomes an open secret. Young men began appearing at the gates of Valerius Manor, each with some claim, some story, some half-prepared evidence. Duke Aldrich interviewed every single one of them personally. He sat across from them in his great chair, hands flat on the desk, and he asked them questions. Small questions, the kind that couldn't be researched, the kind that only a child who had lived inside these walls would know. What colour were the curtains in the nursery? What was the name of the kitchen cat that the cook loved? Where did the old Duke hide his spare pipe on evenings when Duchess Seraphine asked him to quit? None of them knew. Not a single one. Aldrich turned them away himself, quietly, with the particular dignity of a man who refuses to cry in front of strangers. Seraphine watched from the upper corridor each time, her hand pressed flat against the stone pillar, her face arranged into an expression that revealed nothing because she had also been trained out of revelation. Young Ilara, 16 years old and already sharper than most adults in the household, watched from the lower corridor. She watched her father's back as he closed the door after each impostor. She watched the way his hand stayed on the door handle for just 1 second too long each time. She understood, even then, that some wounds do not close. They just become part of the architecture. He arrived on a Tuesday, which, in the context of everything that followed, seemed almost insulting. Tuesdays were for ledger reviews and linen changes and the weekly visit from Father Bertram, who came to say prayers with Duchess Seraphine in the chapel. Tuesdays were the least dramatic day in the Valerius calendar. The young man at the gate gave no name to the outer guard. He said only that he had a message for Duke Aldrich that he would deliver to Duke Aldrich alone. The outer guard, a thick-necked man named Gorin, who had been at his post for 11 years, almost turned him away on principle. He had turned away impostors before. He knew the type. Eyes a little too rehearsed, story a little too smooth. But there was something about this one that gave Gorin pause, something he could not name in the report he filed afterward. He let him in. Duke Aldrich received him in the formal sitting room rather than the study, which was his custom with strangers. Seraphine was not present. Ilara was. She had been sitting in the window alcove reading when the young man was brought in, and by the time anyone thought to ask her to leave, she had already seen enough to make her want to stay. He was perhaps 22 or 23, lean in the way that comes from actual scarcity rather than fashionable restraint. His clothes were not fine, but they were clean. His hair was dark, pushed back from his face, and his jaw carried the shadow of someone who had spent too many nights outdoors. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Dark, steady, and this was the thing she kept returning to later, in the sleepless hours. Not hungry. Every other impostor who had come through those doors had hungry eyes. The hunger of men who wanted something. This one's eyes were still. Not dead. Still. Like a man who had already made his peace with whatever was about to happen. Duke Aldrich sat across from him and asked the questions. What colour were the curtains in the nursery? Pale blue, the young man said, with a border of embroidered yellow birds. The bird on the far left panel had a broken wing because the seamstress ran out of gold thread and used orange instead. Duchess Seraphine was always going to have it fixed. Duke Aldrich's hands, flat on the desk, went very still. What was the name of the kitchen cat? Biscuit. She was orange. She only let the head cook, a woman named Hilda, touch her. She knocked a full tray of pastries onto the floor the morning of the midsummer ball, and Hilda cried more over the pastries than the cat. Seraphine, who Ilara had not noticed enter the room, made a sound like something had been punctured inside her chest. Where does Duke Aldrich keep his spare pipe? Here the young man paused. He looked at Aldrich directly. Then he said, "He doesn't." He told Duchess Seraphine he did, so she would stop worrying about him smoking. The real spare pipe is in the left breast pocket of the old blue hunting coat he keeps at the back of the wardrobe in the eastern guest room. He smokes it when he thinks no one is watching, standing at the narrow window that faces the orchard. Duke Aldrich rose from his chair. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He stood in front of the young man and for a long moment said nothing. Then he said, "Show me." The young man reached up and opened the top 3 buttons of his shirt. He pulled the fabric aside. Just below the left collarbone, pressed into his skin like a brand made by something older than memory, was the mark. Starburst. Precise. Unmistakable. The mark of the sun. Duke Aldrich made a sound that Ilara had never heard from him before, and never heard from him again. It was not words. It was something that lived below language, in the part of a person that doesn't learn manners. He put both hands on the young man's face and held him, and Duchess Seraphine crossed the room, and Ilara heard her mother say, over and over, in a voice stripped of all its composure, "Kaelin, Kaelin, Kaelin." Ilara stood in the window alcove and felt 2 things at the same time. The first was relief. The complicated, layered relief of watching 2 people she loved receive something they had been starving for. The second thing she felt she could not name. It moved through her like warm water through a cracked vessel. It settled in her chest, and it scared her badly enough that she looked away from him for the first time since he entered the room. She was 20 years old. She was engaged to be married in 31 days to Duke Julian of the Northern March. She looked at the young man her parents were calling Kaelin, her returned brother, her father's heir. She looked at the line of his jaw and the stillness of his eyes and the way he held himself even in the embrace of 2 strangers who wept over him like he was made of sacred water. And she told herself, clearly and firmly, the way she had been trained to manage herself, "This is nothing. This is nothing. This is nothing." She would spend the next several weeks learning how profoundly she was wrong. Ilara did not sleep the first night. She lay in her bed in the east wing and stared at the canopy above her and conducted a very deliberate internal interrogation of herself, the kind she had learned to perform when emotions threatened to breach the composure that 2 decades of aristocratic conditioning had built around her like a fortress. She was logical. She had always been logical. She had been praised for it since childhood. Her father's cool-headed daughter, her tutor's most reliable student, the girl who never cried at the hunts and never flinched at the political marriages negotiated over her head like weather discussions. She listed what she knew. She had been raised as an only child after Kaelin's disappearance. She had no actual memory of him as an infant. She had been 3 years old. She had grown up with the idea of a brother, the way one grows up with the idea of a saint, present in ritual and story and the grief of others, but not in lived experience. He was not familiar to her. He was a stranger who happened to share, possibly, a bloodline. Possibly. She stopped at that word and held it up in the dark, like a lantern. Possibly. She made a decision before the hour before dawn arrived. Oh, she would not be governed by feeling. She would be governed by evidence. The next morning, while her parents hosted Kaelin at breakfast in the grand dining room, a meal Ilara claimed a headache to avoid, she sent a sealed message through her personal maid, Lena, to a contact she kept very carefully separate from the rest of her life. A woman named Marin, who ran a private investigative guild known in certain circles as the Shadow Walkers. They were not assassins. They were finders of truth, which in Ilara's experience was a far more dangerous occupation. Maren received the message and sent a reply by midday. She would begin immediately. Ilara appeared at dinner that evening in full composure. She wore dark blue, her mother's choice for her since the engagement to Julian made her part of a house that used blue as its primary colour. She sat at her place at the long table, and she greeted the young man who sat across from her with the precise temperature of a woman who is not convinced. "Kaelin," she said, "I hope you found your rooms adequate." He met her eyes across the table and held them for a moment before answering. "More than adequate. Thank you, Ilara." Her name in his voice was a small, specific problem. She noted it. She set it aside. She asked him questions throughout dinner. Careful ones, folded inside ordinary conversation so they didn't announce themselves as interrogation. She asked about his life during the years he was gone, feigning the curiosity of a glad sister rather than the suspicion of a woman conducting due diligence. He answered quietly, without elaboration she hadn't prompted. He spoke of travelling, of working on trade vessels along the southern coast, of learning what he could from whoever was willing to teach him. He did not perform tragedy. He did not dress his history in the kind of theatrical suffering that would have made her parents weep and made a jury sympathise. He simply reported facts, as though what he had survived was just the weather of his life rather than catastrophe. She found this more unsettling than dramatics would have been. Across the table, Duchess Seraphine watched Ilara's careful courtesy and said nothing, but her eyes said something. They said, "I see you, Ilara. Be careful." Ilara cut her meat into precise pieces and asked Kaelin about the southern shipping routes. The first thing that genuinely gave her pause was the dead language. She had been walking through the library 3 days after his arrival, looking for a specific economic treaty document she needed for a meeting with the estate steward, when she heard a sound from the reading alcove at the far end. She followed the sound quietly, out of instinct, and found Kaelin sitting cross-legged on the floor with one of the oldest books from her father's collection open in his lap. He was reading from it, under his breath, slowly, but reading. Not performing the act of reading, actually reading. Ilara recognized the book. It was written in Vethic, the language of an extinct northern civilization that had collapsed 3 centuries ago. There were perhaps 12 scholars in the known territories who could read it. It was kept in the library because Duke Aldrich's great-grandfather had collected antique texts obsessively, not because anyone was expected to use it. She stood in the shadow of the bookshelf and watched him read. After a long moment, she said, in Vethic, "What does that passage say?" He looked up. He did not look startled. That stillness again, the quality of a man whose nerves had been educated by circumstances she had not yet determined, he answered her in Vethic. It says, "The house built on the bones of a lie will stand only as long as the bones hold. When they crumble, the walls come down together." She switched back to their common tongue. "Where did you learn Vethic?" "From a scholar in the port city of Vassar," he said. "A man named Dorian, who traded books for meals. I spent a winter with him. He had nothing else to give, and I had nothing else to receive." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That is either a very truthful answer or a very carefully prepared one." He said, "I know. I wouldn't blame you for not knowing which." She left the library without the treaty document. The second thing that gave her pause was the blade. Duke Aldrich, in the first flush of recovered joy, had organised a demonstration morning in the east courtyard. a chance for the household guards and visiting nobles to observe the returned heir in a formal sparring match. It was the kind of event designed to re-establish Kaelan in the social hierarchy of the estate, to give him credibility in front of the men whose respect he would need. Ilara attended because it would have been conspicuous not to. The sparring master, a broad-shouldered man named Holt, who had trained every male fighter on the estate for 16 years, stepped into the ring against Kaelan with the professional confidence of someone who expected to control the match. What happened instead was not recklessness or aggression. It was something quieter and far more impressive. Kaelan moved like a man who had learned to fight in places where losing was not an academic failure, but a permanent one. His footwork was not the trained footwork of a fencing master. It was something older, more instinctive. He read Holt's weight shifts before they became movements. He placed himself not where the textbook said to place oneself, but where the particular living body of the particular opponent in front of him made it most advantageous to be. He ended the match in 4 exchanges. He did it without apparent effort, which Ilara suspected took more control than the effort itself would have. The courtyard was very quiet for a moment. Then Duke Aldrich laughed, the open laugh of a proud father, and clapped twice, and the assembled household followed suit. Ilara watched Kaelan lower his blade and accept Holt's grudging nod of acknowledgement. She watched him look across the courtyard at the assembled faces and not perform triumph. Just stand there, quiet and present and absolutely unreadable, while the applause moved around him like water around a stone. She went inside before the gathering dispersed. In her rooms, she sat at her writing desk and pressed her hands flat against the surface and said to herself, very quietly and very clearly, "You need Maren's report. You need facts. You need to know who he actually is. And then this will make sense. And then it will stop." She wrote another letter to Maren. She asked for acceleration. She enclosed double the usual payment. The gala was Duke Aldrich's idea, a pre-wedding celebration for Ilara and Julian, hosted at the estate of Count Renard, a 3-hour carriage ride north. It was also, Ilara understood, an opportunity to present Kaelan to a wider circle of nobility, to begin the social rehabilitation of the Valerius heir in the territory's collective consciousness. Duke Julian arrived the evening before to join the travelling party. He was a tall man, impeccably constructed in the way of men who treat their appearance as an extension of political strategy. The jaw sharp, the crest of silver at his temple precisely where a man of 40 benefits from silver being. He greeted Duke Aldrich with the respect owed to his future father-in-law and Duchess Seraphine with elaborate courtesy, and Ilara with the proprietary warmth of a man who has already filed the paperwork. He greeted Kaelan with a smile that reached approximately as far as his cheekbones and went no further. "Kaelan," Julian said, extending his hand. "What a remarkable thing." "I've heard the whole story, of course. The entire territory has." Kaelan took the offered hand. "Julian," he said, "the congratulations on your upcoming wedding, I assume, are already given?" Julian's smile recalibrated by a fraction. Ilara noticed. She doubted Kaelan missed it either. The carriage convoy departed at dawn. Ilara rode in the second carriage with Lena and her lady-in-waiting, Petra, a round-faced woman of her own age, who had been assigned to her since she was 18, and who had the particular talent of making herself furniture when Ilara needed to think. Kaelan rode ahead with the outriders. Duke Aldrich and Seraphine occupied the first carriage. Julian rode on horseback at the front of the column. They were 2 hours into the journey, moving through the corridor of tall beeches that marked the northern border of the Valerius estate, when the beech trunks exploded with movement. The bandits were not amateurs. They had clearly scouted the route and timed the attack for the narrowest point of the road, where the trees came closest to both sides and the carriage speed was necessarily reduced. They took the outriders first. Ilara heard the shouting, and then the sound of horses, and then a crash that told her the lead carriage had been stopped. Petra screamed. Lena grabbed Ilara's arm. Ilara pulled free of Lena's hand and reached under the seat for the small blade she kept in a case her father had given her on her 18th birthday, accompanied by a speech about how no woman in his family would be entirely without recourse. The carriage door was wrenched open from the outside. What happened next was less than 2 minutes in duration, and left impressions on Ilara that would outlast, she suspected, nearly everything else in her life. She saw Kaelin come through the attacking men the way water finds the path of least resistance. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just devastatingly efficient. He had taken a position at the door of her carriage, and he simply did not allow anyone through it. He was cut across the upper left arm early in the exchange. She saw the blood and the way he absorbed the pain without acknowledgement, the way a man absorbs pain when he has decided ahead of time that it is not going to matter. He killed 1 man. He incapacitated 3 others. The bandits retreated into the trees. The road went silent. Kaelin turned from the tree line and looked at the carriage door. Ilara was standing in it. She had climbed out during the fight. She couldn't have said why. Some refusal of the passivity of waiting. He looked at her. She looked at him. His left arm was bleeding steadily onto the road. He wasn't looking at the arm. She reached up and took his face in her hands, checking him. His eyes, his colour. The automatic assessment of someone in the aftermath of violence, checking the person closest to them for damage. She felt him go absolutely still under her hands, the way a man goes still when something has reached below the architecture of his composure. She was not thinking. She was operating on the post-fear clarity of a woman whose body had briefly overridden the decades of training. She kissed him. It was brief. Less than a breath. She pulled back, and the full weight of what she had done landed on her immediately and completely. They stood on the road in the ruins of the ambush site and looked at each other, and neither of them spoke, and the blood from his arm dripped on the dirt between them, and Lena called from the carriage, asking if they were all right, and Ilara said yes, and she was lying. She did not sleep that night either. She lay in the guest room at Count Renard's estate, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying, because she had found over years of practice that the only thing worse than feeling a difficult thing was postponing feeling it. The postponed weight always collected interest. She was in love with a man she had spent 3 weeks believing was her brother. She said the sentence to herself in the dark, with the particular cruelty that precise language sometimes requires, because imprecision was a luxury she could not afford. She was a woman 31 days from her wedding to Duke Julian of the Northern March, and she was in love with a man who might be the legitimate heir to her father's title, which would make him her brother, which was an impossibility she could not survive emotionally or socially or morally. Except Marin's report had not yet arrived. Except she had sent Marin to investigate his origins, and Marin had not written, which meant Marin had not yet confirmed what everyone in the household was choosing to believe. Possibly, she said again to the dark. Hold on to possibly. She pressed her hands over her eyes and thought about the road, the absolute stillness of him under her hands, the way he had looked at her in the aftermath. Not shocked, not scandalized, not taking advantage. Just looking at her as though she were the most important problem he had ever been asked to solve, and he intended to solve it honestly. She thought about Duke Julian. She thought about the way Julian had smiled at Kaelin with his mouth while watching him with eyes that were taking measurements. Julian was taking measurements. She had not been wrong about that. He observed things the way a surveyor observes terrain, continuously, systematically, building a map in real time. He had been doing it his whole life because he had built a significant political position on the ability to identify threat before threat identified itself to him. He identified the threat the morning after the bandit attack, at breakfast in Count Renard's great hall. He was watching Ilara across the table. This was not unusual. He often watched Ilara. But what he was watching for this morning was specific. He watched her not look at Kaelin. He understood immediately that the effort not to look is categorically different from indifference. Indifference requires no effort. Deliberate avoidance requires constant, low-level maintenance. He recognized the maintenance. He had deployed it himself in situations where he needed to conceal interest. Julian said nothing. He completed his breakfast. He excused himself to write letters, and he wrote one letter to a man in the capital who ran a different kind of investigative operation than Marin's shadow walkers, less principled, more thorough. He asked for everything available on the young man calling himself Kaelin Valerius, with specific priority given to origins, known associates, and whoever might have prepared him for this performance. Julian did not love Ilara. He was aware of this the way one is aware of a fact that carries no emotional charge, as information, not feeling. But Ilara was his path to the Valerius inheritance, and the Valerius inheritance was his path to a territorial consolidation that he had been planning for 7 years. A living male heir complicated that path in ways he was not prepared to accommodate. He sealed the letter and had it dispatched within the hour. He returned to the public rooms of Count Renard's estate and smiled at Kaelin across the sitting room and said, "How is the arm?" Kaelin said, "Healing." "Thank you, Julian." Julian said, "We're lucky you were there." He meant the opposite of what he said, and both men knew it, and both men smiled pleasantly at each other, and the fire in the hearth continued burning as though none of it had happened. Marin's report arrived 12 days later, delivered by a runner to Lena, who brought it to Ilara in the garden before anyone else was awake. Ilara read it standing at the fountain, in the same spot where she had stood 3 weeks earlier reading Kaelin's letter. The symmetry felt deliberate, though she knew it wasn't. Marin's handwriting was small and efficient. She had gone north. Following the few details Kaelin had provided about his earliest memories, a village, a fire, a woman who had carried him away, she had traced a route through the northern hill territories to a place that no longer existed, a village called Solon. Solon had been burned, not by bandits, not by any named enemy. The records, such as they existed, pointed unmistakably toward a punitive raid ordered 15 years ago by a regional lord acting on instructions from a higher authority. The authority, Marin had traced with painstaking care through 3 layers of intermediaries, was Duke Aldrich of Valerius. Ilara stopped reading. She started again from the beginning of the relevant paragraph and read it twice more, making absolutely certain she had understood. Duke Aldrich had ordered the burning of Solon 15 years ago. Why? Marin had not yet determined with certainty, though she offered a provisional answer in her final paragraph that Ilara needed to sit down to read. She did not sit down. She stood at the fountain and read. Marin believed Solon was connected to the disappearance of the real Kaelin Valerius. Specifically, Marin believed that the trail of the real heir had led Duke Aldrich's trackers to Solon, that someone in Solon knew where the real Kaelin had been taken, or was sheltering someone who did, or worse, that the real Caelan had died years earlier, and Duke Aldrich had ordered the village burned to eliminate the witnesses to that truth, to allow the fiction of a missing heir to continue. Because a missing heir was still hope, and a dead child was something Aldrich could not survive knowing. One boy survived the burning of Solon. A child of 7 or 8, records uncertain. He had been found by travelling merchants and carried south. He would have been approximately 22 or 23 years old now. He would have had no family, no history, no name with any legal weight. He would have had every reason to hate the house of Valerius, and he would have known, because survivors of such things always eventually find out the shape of what destroyed them, that Duke Aldrich had taken something from him. Ilara stood at the fountain with Marin's report in her hands and understood. He was not her brother. He had never been her brother. He was a boy her father had orphaned. He had come into this house wearing the borrowed skin of a dead heir, armed with knowledge he had spent years collecting, to take back something from the man who had taken everything from him. She thought about what he had taken: a season of being called Caelan, a season of being held by 2 people who wept over him, a season of something she suspected he had never had before and could not resist, even knowing it was built on a lie. She thought about the road, the stillness under her hands. She understood something else then, the hardest thing, the thing that made the fountain blur in front of her. Whatever he had come here to take, he had also stayed too long. Long enough for it to become something he didn't plan. Long enough to read to her from a dead language in a library and catch her carriage door against his own body so nothing could come through it. She folded Marin's report. She pressed it against her chest alongside the letter. She needed to tell him. She needed to tell him before anyone else did. She was already too late. Duke Julian did not wait for Ilara to act. Julian had never waited for someone else to act when he could act first, and his investigator had returned with a report the day before Marin's reached Ilara. Faster, because Julian's man was less principled about methods and more willing to apply pressure to sources who hesitated. He chose the royal presentation evening. It was the formal gathering Aldrich had planned as the official public restoration of his heir to society, the candles, the full attendance of every noble family in allied territory, the sumptuous dinner, and the announcement that the house of Valerius was whole again. The room was full. The timing was surgical. Julian rose at the end of the first course, before Aldrich could make his planned remarks, and asked permission to speak. Aldrich, surprised but socialized into courtesy, gave it. Julian was a gifted speaker. He was not given to theatrics, but he understood architecture, the building of a point through steady accumulation until the weight of it was undeniable. He spoke about the joyful return of the Valerius heir. He expressed with every appearance of warmth how much the household's happiness had meant to him as Ilara's future husband. He spoke about the importance of legitimacy to the nobility. He spoke about the responsibility they all shared to one another and to truth. Then he placed on the table a series of documents his investigator had gathered. The burned village, the trail of the boy who survived, 3 witnesses who would testify to the young man's actual origins, obtained through methods Julian did not specify. The room, which had been eating its soup, went entirely silent. Duke Aldrich rose from his seat slowly. He was 61 years old, and he had the deep stillness of a man absorbing something that may shatter him, but has not shattered him yet. He looked at the documents. He looked at Julian. Then he turned and looked at the young man sitting 3 seats from Ilara on the left side of the table. The young man who had been called Caelan for the past several weeks, who had eaten at this table and read in this library, and fought on that road, and looked at Ilara with the eyes of a man who had stopped performing something and started feeling it. Aldrich said his name. Not Kalen. He said, "Boy." The room waited. As the young man, and in this moment, Ilara understood there was no name left to call him that fit what she now knew he was, looked back at Duke Aldrich, and he did not flinch, and he did not perform remorse. He met the old Duke's eyes and waited. Aldrich said, "Is it true?" A pause of 3 seconds that contained more than most people experience in a year. Then, "Yes." The room erupted. Duke Aldrich sat down, just sat down, as though his legs had made a decision that his mind had not yet authorized. Seraphine's hand went to her mouth. Ilara sat perfectly still and watched her father's face and felt something crack inside her chest that she did not have a name for either. Not grief, not anger, something older and more structural. Aldrich's voice, when it came back, was the voice of a man who has been publicly unmade and is choosing, in real time, how to carry it. He said to the guards at the door, "Take him." The guards moved. Ilara stood up. She stood up, and the motion was so abrupt and so completely at odds with every protocol of the evening that several people near her actually recoiled slightly. She was the Duchess's daughter, the future wife of Julian of the Northern March, a woman who had never in her life made a scene at a formal dinner. She stood up and looked at her father and said, "Aldrich." She had never called him that in her life. She had called him father, or, in formal settings, your grace. The use of his given name in that room at that moment was a statement that everyone present understood before she made another. She said, "Before you do this, you will tell the room what Maren has found in the Northern Hill territories. You will tell this room about Solon." The colour left Aldrich's face. Ilara said, "If you will not, I will." Julian, still standing, said, "Ilara, this is not the—" Ilara turned to Julian, and whatever was in her face stopped his sentence mid-breath. She had never looked at him that way before. He had thought, in the way of men who underestimate composure for compliance, that she was manageable. He was revising that estimate in real time. She said, "Julian, sit down. When I am finished, you will understand that you have no position left to speak from in this house." She turned back to the room. She said, clearly, to everyone present, "My father ordered the destruction of a village 15 years ago. In that village was a child who survived. The young man you are looking at is that child. He is not my brother. He was never my brother. He is the victim of a choice my father made to protect himself from a grief he could not face. And he came here because what was taken from him, his home, his family, his entire history, was taken by the man who sits at the head of this table." The room was beyond silent. She looked at her father then, and her voice changed. It was not cruelty, what she felt. She knew it wasn't cruelty because cruelty would have been easier. It was grief. Her own. She said quietly, "I love you, Aldrich. But you burned something down that was not yours to burn." Aldrich looked at his daughter. He looked at his hands. He said nothing. But he looked at the guards, and he made a gesture that stopped their advance. In the confusion of the room erupting again, voices, movement, the collapse of an evening into chaos, Ilara moved. She went to the young man who had no name she could give him. She went to him, and she took his arm, and she said one word into his ear. "Come." The servant tunnels under Valerius Manor were built 200 years ago during a period of political instability when the family of that era had wanted multiple escape routes from their own home. The irony of their purpose was not lost on Ilara as she moved through them in near dark with him at her side. She had a lamp. She knew every turn. She had explored these tunnels as a child, when exploration was still something she was permitted to do freely. They did not speak for the first several minutes. She led him through the turns, and he followed, and the silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who are carrying the same enormous weight and haven't yet determined who should put it down first. The tunnel ended at a low iron door in the side of the hill behind the eastern garden wall. She pushed it open. The night air came in, cool and smelling of wet grass. He stopped in the doorway. She stopped facing him. She said, "I know who you are, not what your name is. I know what you are." He said, "Ilara." She said, "You should have told me." He said, "I know." She said, "What was your plan? What was it supposed to—" She stopped. She pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment. Then she said, "You were going to leave eventually. You knew it couldn't hold." He said, "I had a plan when I arrived." The plan stopped mattering somewhere around the library. She said, "You can't stay." He said, "I know that." She said, "My father's guards won't pursue you past the Eastern Road. He won't want the exposure of a public chase. Julian will try, but Julian's jurisdiction ends at the northern border tonight, because I am going to end the engagement, and I am going to take Julian apart in public, and by morning he will have too many of his own problems to focus on yours." He looked at her. He said, "That is a great deal to do in one night." She said, "I have been composing myself my entire life. I would very much like, at some point, to use that composure for something worth the effort." He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached inside his coat and removed a folded piece of parchment and held it out to her. She looked at it. She did not take it yet. He said, "I will not ask you to wait for me. I have nothing to offer you tonight, and I know it. But I want you to know that what happened on the road was not a performance. None of it was, after the first week. I came here for a kind of justice that I thought I understood, and I understood it wrong. And I am leaving with something I did not plan for." She took the letter. Her fingers touched his hand in the taking of it, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then she said, "Go. Now. Before I change the reasoning." He went. She stood in the iron doorway and listened to his footsteps in the grass until they disappeared. And then she stood there a little longer, and then she closed the door and went back through the tunnels because she had a room full of nobility to manage and a man she had agreed to marry to dismantle in front of witnesses. She was remarkably calm, walking back through the dark. Later, she would understand it was the calm that comes from having made the most important decision of your life and knowing, completely and without ambiguity, that it was right. She dismantled Julian the way she had always done her best work, precisely, without performance, and with evidence she had organized in advance. She stood in front of the assembled room, which had not dispersed because no one quite knew how, and she told them about Julian's Eastern Territory accounts, which she had been given access to as part of the pre-wedding financial disclosure, and which she had, over the past several weeks, read very carefully. She told them about the taxes collected from 3 villages that never appeared in any official record. She told them about the contracts he had signed with a particular trading house whose primary business was not, as advertised, silk. Julian stood and told the room she was hysterical. He used the word hysterical. In front of 60 witnesses who were all watching her stand perfectly still with a stack of organized documents and a voice she could have been using to read a weather report. The silence that followed his use of the word was deeply satisfying. Ilara did not acknowledge it. She continued. By the time she was finished, Julian had no engagement. He also had questions to answer in the morning. He left the room without saying another word to her, which was, she thought, the first genuinely intelligent choice she had ever seen him make. She went to her parents. She sat between her father and her mother, and Aldrich looked at her with the eyes of a man who has seen who his daughter actually is for the first time. He reached out and took her hand. He did not apologize. She did not ask him to. There would be time for that. There would be a great deal of time. Time moved differently after that. Ilara had always thought of time as a sequence, days arranged behind each other in single file, each one producing the next. But grief and change moved in seasons, not sequences. They moved in the way the garden moved. The first spring after, she planted new roses along the west wall. A variety she chose herself, deep red, which was not the house colour and had never been the house colour. But she was the Duchess now, and she would choose the colour. Duke Aldrich died in his study on a winter morning 3 years after the night at the manor. He died in his chair with his hands flat on the desk, the way he always sat. Seraphine found him. She called for Ilara before she called for anyone else. Ilara sat with her mother through the first night, and through the service, and through the first weeks of solitude that followed a man who had filled too much space in a house. She managed the estate transition without error, which no one who knew her was surprised by. Seraphine lived for 7 more years after Aldrich. She died in the East Garden on a warm afternoon in late summer, in her chair by the fountain, which was where she had taken to sitting in her final years. When Ilara found her, her face was arranged in the expression of a woman who has put down a weight she had been carrying for 40 years. Ilara was alone in the manor then. She was 35. Suitors came, as suitors always come to a powerful and unattached woman of property. They were managed politely, firmly, and without the slightest ambiguity. One particularly persistent baron from the Western Territories requested an explanation for her persistent refusals. She gave him one. She said she was already spoken for. He asked by whom. She said it was a private arrangement. He left. She went back to her ledgers. She did not wait passively. She was not built for passive waiting. She expanded the estate's trade connections, negotiated 2 significant water rights agreements that her father had let lapse, reorganized the tenant structures on the farming land in ways that increased both yield and the tenant family's share of it. She built a small library in the village because she passed through it one afternoon and noticed the children had nowhere to read. But she kept the letter. She kept it against her chest, and she reread it on mornings when the need to was strongest. And on some mornings the need was not strong at all. And on some mornings it was the only thing in the world that felt solid. She was 38 when the merchant arrived. She heard about him first from the estate steward, a fastidious man named Orlin, who managed the Valerius accounts and who had no instinct for drama but a complete one for information that affected commerce. Orlin told her that a merchant king from the Southern Isles had arrived in the territory with a trading fleet and a letter of introduction from 3 separate heads of state. He was buying estate wine in significant quantities and asking, Orlin noted with a slightly puzzled expression, specifically about the Valerius label. Ilara set down her pen. She said, "Where is he?" Orlin said, "He sent word that he would call on the estate tomorrow, if your grace permitted." She looked at her steward for a moment. Then she said, "Tell him he is permitted." She did not sleep that night. She did not expect to. She was in the garden before dawn, as she always was, though she had given up pretending this was about the roses some years earlier. She stood at the fountain. The broken-winged cherub looked back at her. She had never repaired it. She understood now why her father had said it gave the cherub character. Damage, survived and integrated, does give things character. She was living proof. She had the letter in her hands. She did not read it. She held it. She heard footsteps on the garden path behind her. She did not turn immediately. She gave herself one more breath, the last breath of the version of this that lived only in her memory and the old parchment in her hands. Then she turned. He was not what she expected, which was to say he was completely what she expected, because she had always known, on some level below reason, in the part of herself she had trained into silence for 15 years, that when he came back, he would have built himself into something real. He was not wearing rags. He was dressed simply, for a man of his apparent means. Dark coat, well cut. No ornamentation beyond what the quality of the fabric communicated on its own. He was broader across the shoulders than she remembered, which was what years and physical work did to a man's body. His hair was pushed back from his face. The jaw still carried shadow. The eyes were exactly the same. Dark, steady, and still. Not the stillness of emptiness. The stillness of a man who knows precisely where he stands. He stopped at the edge of the fountain. When he looked at her, she said, "You took 15 years. He said, "I said I would come back when I had something real to offer." She said, "And do you?" He said, "3 trade routes, a fleet of 12 vessels, territory on the Southern Isles that I hold in my own name, under my own name, which I chose myself, a merchant council in 3 cities that will send representatives when I call. None of it inherited, none of it borrowed, none of it built on anyone else's story." She looked at him. He said, "I also have a name, if you want to know it." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I chose Solon, after the village. It felt right to carry it forward." She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the letter in her hands. Then she held it out to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "You kept it." She said, "You said you would come back. I believed you." And he said, "Ilara." She said, "Solon." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. He did not perform it. He just covered the ground, the way he covered ground, directly, without decoration. He stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and there was no longer anything between them. Not a name that didn't fit. Not a family tie that never existed. Not a fiancé. Not a court. Not a room full of people who needed managing. Just the fountain. The broken cherub. The early morning light. The letter passing from her hands back to his. He said, "I thought about you every day. I want you to know that, not as justification, just as a fact you deserve to have." She said, "I know. I thought about you too. I was more disciplined about it on most days." He almost smiled. She had forgotten how rare that was from him, the almost smile, and how much it meant precisely because it was rare. She said, "There is no blood between us. There never was." He said, "No." She said, "There is only what we choose." He said, "Yes." She put her hand against his chest, just below the left collarbone, against the mark she knew was there. She felt him breathe. She said, "Then I choose this." He covered her hand with his. The garden was very quiet. The roses along the west wall, deep red and entirely her own choosing, held the morning light the way living things hold what they have been waiting for, completely, without reservation, as though they had always known it was coming.